Morning. Thanks for joining us. Hello.
Good morning, folks. Really glad you're joining us. Thanks to people who are saying hello in the chat. It's nice to see, lovely to see some familiar names and new people joining us.
Yeah, if you can put your name and your pronouns and the organizations in the chat, that'll be great.
And also add which lands you're joining us from. We are at the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So if you can put in the chat which lands you're joining us from, that would be great.
So I'm gonna go ahead and let's start.
We're in your hands, Adam. Thank you.
My name is Adam Kusa. I'm the National Projects Manager at Rainbow Refugee Society. Rainbow Coalition for Refuge and Rainbow Refugee respects and expresses solidarity with Indigenous rights to sovereignty, land, and livelihood. As an organization working in Canada with people who have been forcibly displaced, we recognize our responsibilities to redress ongoing colonial injustice against First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. We respect and thank Indigenous peoples for their care and stewardship of the land, air, and water we all rely on. And we're committed to a long-term process of self-education, of listening and learning from Indigenous perspectives, and of building respectful relationships with Two-Spirits and Indigenous organizations as we move towards decolonizing our practices. And with that, me and my colleagues at Rainbow Refugees works on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. Thank you for everyone who are acknowledging their lands, and I'll invite you to do the same as well. I also understand that you might be familiar with some of the information that we're sharing today, but others might be hearing this for the first time. So I appreciate your patience as we make sure everyone is on the same page of understanding. There's a live interpretation of this webinar in French, thanks to our interpreters, Alain and Francis. Si vous voulez entendre en français et vous utilisez then dans les contrôles de votre réunion webinaire, cliquez sur la langue que vous souhaitez entendre. Et pour entendre uniquement la version traduite, cliquez sur désactiver le son de You're joining from your mobile device, whether you're using Android or iOS. In your meeting controls, tap the ellipses and tap the language interpretation, and tap the language you want to hear, and you can tap the toggle to mute the original audio, and then click done. You are currently in the webinar mode. We love interactive spaces, and we'd like to make this webinar as engaging as possible. We'll leave this decision to you on how you'd like to participate. You have two options. The first one is join us in interactive space to ask questions and share experience live. You'll be part of the recording of this webinar that will be put on later on a resource hub. If you want this option, then please click on the raise your hand button at the meeting controls, and I will happily move you to a panelist and we'll be able to see you if you'd like. And the option 2 is basically stay in the webinar audience and post questions in the Q&A section or chat. So I see 2 people who have raised their hand already. I'll happily move you to as a panelist, so you need to accept that, okay? And if anyone else want that, or if you decided to change your mind, I can put you back in the webinar mode, that's fine. Thank you, folks. Anyone else? Perfect.
Lovely to have a few people join us. Thank you.
Okay, I hope I moved everyone. If not, please be patient with me.
And to encourage those who are joining us as panelists, if you would like to turn on your camera and you don't mind being recorded and your face being shown in the video, that would be lovely, just to see a few faces while we're talking and having interactions with you.
I prefer not to feel like a midnight DJ when I'm presenting, so would love a few more friendly faces.
It says that it won't let them turn on the cameras. Adam.
Oh yeah, actually I will do that in a bit. So, yeah, please bear with me.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll introduce the plan for today. We will be talking, we'll be understanding actually the Rainbow Coalition for Refuge. Who are we and what do we do? And then we'll understand like international context of LGBTQI migration, and followed by the advocacy work for equity in Canada, from exclusion to inclusion. And also we'll understand the pathways available for in Canada refugees and also overseas. And to talk about that, we have our speakers for today. Chris Morrissey is the co-founder of Legit and Rainbow Refugee Society. And we have Sharon Jordan, the board chair of Rainbow Refugee Society and the co-chair of the Rainbow Coalition for Refuge. And we have Alex Dugman Mansour, co-executive director of Rainbow Refugee Society, programming and advocacy. And I will turn things over to Charlene.
Thank you, Adam. And thank you so much, everyone who is joining. Really excited to be sharing some of our history and work with you together. Rainbow Refugee is hosting today, but we are hosting on behalf of the Rainbow Coalition for Refuge, which is an emerging coalition, and we're kind of proud co-chairs of it alongside Rainbow Railroad. And as you'll see, we have organizations who are all focused on enhancing the safety and equity of refugee protection for people who are fleeing sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, or sex characteristic-based persecution. And you can see we have organizations all the way out in Halifax, in Quebec and Ontario, the Prairies, and out here in the West. So our work, next slide, Adam. Thank you. Our work is in building a safety network that stretches across the country. We now have 21 member organizations. 5 of the steering committee members that I introduced earlier serve as sort of regional hubs to extend kind of networks in their local communities. We've been hosting virtual gatherings during the pandemic, and we are moving into in-person gatherings. And so far I've had over 100 people participate, or 100 different organizations participate from across the country in sort of building a community of practice around better supports, creating prepared arrival communities for people who are fleeing SOGI-esque persecution. We want to start out today sharing a little bit about the international context of our work before we dive into sort of some of the advocacy history and issues in queer and trans migration. And so I'll start with the next slide, Adam, and this next batch moves pretty quickly. So recognizing that LGBTQI human rights are protected as human rights and respected as human rights internationally, and at the same time, that protection is uneven. So what we see, next slide please, is that there are still more than half of UN member states that do not respect and protect the human rights of sexually or gender diverse peoples. And next slides. That includes at least 68 countries that continue to explicitly criminalize same-sex relationships. And next slide. Another around 58 that criminalize gender diversity. And I say around because that criminalization is a bit, sometimes it is explicitly around behaviors, sometimes it's through discriminatory uses of laws like public health and public morality laws. We want to remind everyone, and I'm sure this is history that you are becoming more and more aware of, but that the vast majority of the laws, the religious codes, the medical and psychological codes that have been used to persecute, to fuel hatred of queer and trans people are based in laws and systems that were imposed by colonial powers. And so you'll see kind of regional patterns based on which country has colonized. So just kind of keeping that present as we move forward in our presentation. I think next slide, please, Adam. Thank you. And so I'm going to share a little bit about some of the history and advocacy work being done, or that has been done and being done around building equity for LGBTQI people in Canada, starting with kind of situating us in some of the exclusions and tensions that are present in Canada's immigration system that we have to kind of both work with and against in our work. And so it can be helpful to think about Canada's immigration policy as a conversation or dialogue that's been going on for several hundred years with competing priorities or voices. And so that first voice is that one of kind of colonial expansion and nation building priorities. And the priorities that we've kind of inherited from that are explicitly white supremacist and racist exclusions and a heteronormative model of the family, sort of who was wanted on this land by British settlers. Then the next voice is around kind of the priorities that came with globalization. Oh, Adam, can we go back a bit? Thank you. In terms of increasing mobility for people who bring skills and capital, building a reputation for Canada as a humanitarian actor on the global stage. And what we see during this is sort of a move from explicit to implicit racism and of official policy of multiculturalism. So kind of, again, keeping that context in mind, this is some of the tensions that we face as we do our work. And can we look at the next slide, Adam? And so what we've ended up with is a system with sort of three, what are called classes of immigration: an economic class, a family class with the goal of reunifying families, and then a humanitarian class. And this is where refugee and humanitarian and compassionate applications lie. What we've seen is Canada, historically and to the present, has policies and practices that exclude LGBTQI people. And so Canada explicitly criminalized same-sex sexualities up through 1969 and had a policies right up into the 1980s where we were considered undesirable migrants. The economic class policy still contains practices that are constraints against people who are HIV positive being able to immigrate and use the economic class. The family class and sort of recognition of us and our families, we were excluded from this class up until 2002. And Chris, in a few minutes, is going to speak about the work we did to kind of resist and work against those exclusions. And then as we move along in our presentation, the humanitarian classes where sort of refugee protection is managed through policies and practices. And Alex and I are going to be talking about some of the work we've been doing to kind of ensure and promote equity and fairness for queer and trans people who need refugee protection. I think we can move along, Adam. Thank you. Yeah, and so here I'm going to turn things over to Chris to tell us a little bit about Legit and Legit's work in advocating for inclusion of LGBTQI people in Canada's family class migration. Oh, Chris, you're muted.
Thank you. So I wanted to say thanks, Sherilyn, and welcome to everybody across the country who has joined us. In 1989, my partner Bridget and I returned to Canada after having lived and worked overseas for a number of years. And we were faced with, Bridget was not a Canadian citizen, and so we were faced with trying to find a way to continue our relationship in Canada, since my parents were still alive. Next slide. So we researched and searched for different ways to actually see that she could come as a permanent resident. All of them failed. And so one day I said to her, I think we're going to have to go to court. I have no idea why I said that or where that came from, but in fact, that's what we ended up having to do. So in 1992, I filed a suit in federal court alleging discrimination against the Queen and the Minister of Immigration. Next slide. And so as a result of that, while we never spent a day in court, we were successful in Bridget actually being granted permanent residence. Immigration did not like and still doesn't like any court challenges that might change their legislation. So we were successful with that, with Bridget, but we also had done this with the intention of getting the legislation changed. So when they gave her permanent residence, nothing changed in terms of the law. Next slide, please. And so what we did was to gather together a group of people who had the same challenge that we had, and decided to work together to actually change the legislation. And so the organization was formed, and we were called LEGIT. In those days, LEGIT stood for Lesbian and Gay Immigration Task Force. It's now LEGIT, International Immigration to Canada for Same-Sex Partners, to be more inclusive. So we worked and worked. We worked for 10 years together. We wrote briefs to the 4 ministers of immigration. We spent hours talking to MPs. We visited their offices. Every time there was a meeting about immigration and changing the Immigration Act, we were there asking questions about LGBT folks. And so we spent hours as well talking to bureaucrats, trying to get them to understand what our families were like in order for them to write the legislation that would actually work for us. We went to the Standing Committee on Immigration twice in order to get the members of Parliament on that, and the members of Parliament to make the changes in the immigration legislation. Next slide, please. And even though it took us 10 years, at some point in that 10-year time, we were able to meet with a person who was the consul in Seattle and talk to him about the discrimination that we were experiencing. And so he agreed that he would actually process same-sex partner applications on humanitarian and compassionate grounds. So we were successful in actually getting something in practice, even though the legislation hadn't changed. Next slide, please. So one of the things we were able to do was to set up a website. It was kind of the early days of websites. And so we got funding from the Legal Aid Society to do that. Next slide. Once that happened, we began to get emails from all over the world from people who were looking for ways that they could come to Canada in order to be safe. Slide. And so what we did as a result of all of these emails, and we were really concerned about how were we going to respond. And so what we did was we put out a call to the community here locally to come together to see if we could come up with a strategy to actually begin sponsorship of LGBT folks from overseas. So we held this meeting in Rob's office, and Rob is a co-founder with me of the organization. We came together and we looked around the room and we saw that there were about 3 people in the room who were Canadian citizens and in a position to be able to do any sponsorship. Everybody else was someone who had come from another country and who was afraid to go home and wanted to find a way to stay here. And so we looked at the crowd, and after we finished the meeting, we looked at each other and we said, well, I guess what we need to do is to actually respond to the needs of the people who showed up tonight. And Rainbow Refugee was born.
I think this is where I jump in. Yeah, Chris?
Yep.
Fantastic. Yeah, I was one of the people to benefit from Legit back in 2001. So my work in advocacy work in queer and trans migration very much came from a place of needing help and support, feeling the hope that being with a group of people facing a similar struggle and sharing struggles could bring, and also witnessing the work that Chris and others at Legit were doing in changing legislation, and sort of that process of, by sharing stories, by supporting each other through system navigation, we then learned the things that we could bring into making changes in the legislation through training, through strategic litigation, was through presentations to standing committees and conversations with parliamentarians, is something that I learned firsthand from Chris, and that we've been trying to carry forward in the coalition and in Rainbow Refugee. So now we get to we're moving from the family class of immigration and the efforts to increase equity and access for queer and trans people in the family class to refugee protection pathways and protection for people who have survived SOGS persecution. So Rainbow Refugee began holding regular meetings in 2001. Adam, I'll have the next slide, please. And as we listened to the challenges of people who had made it to Canada to start a refugee claim, we started learning about some of the distinct impacts of SOGS persecution, ways that it can be extremely isolating, ways that it starts in families and leaves people, often alone to navigate the refugee system, ways that it often means the people who most need protection are often not able to leave their countries. Women, trans people have difficulties at borders, may need the support of a male relative to travel. So we learned about the distinct challenges of SOGS persecution and some of the distinct exclusions from refugee protection that queer and trans refugees were facing. We also saw, and this was particularly true from 2010 on, but I would say it started even in the 2000s, we were seeing that seeking asylum, although it is an internationally protected right, was becoming increasingly dangerous for everyone, for all refugees, but it had unique and distinct risks for queer and trans refugees that policy simply did not understand or reflect. And then we saw that when people were arriving in Canada, again, because of kind of the exclusions around racism, homophobia, transphobia, sexism, people living on income assistance or in poverty, those kinds of intersections meant that people were not experiencing settlement supports way other newcomers were. And so we felt as community, we were sort of in the best position to support people in their journeys in settlement and to thrive beyond settlement. We very much saw it as an act of solidarity, and almost an extension of the practice of chosen family that queer and trans people have been using their whole lives. Next slide. So some of the work, we got to work fairly early. This actually, yeah, no, that other slide is good, Adam, thank you. This one's perfect. We got to work initially with the refugee board because we were seeing real problems with the decision-making, ways that some of the stereotypes of LGBTQ in North America were being applied inappropriately to refugees, expecting that they would immediately come out and find community. There was a case of a lesbian who was told she could be perfectly safe if she went back home because she was an attractive woman. We saw some really horrendous decisions in the early days. And so that's where we worked on a case-by-case basis, kind of doing training, and then eventually had the opportunity to give input into the guidelines that were developed in 2016 and 17 on SOGI-esque decision-making. And then Nicholas Hirsch, who's in Ottawa, an Ottawa-based lawyer, he and I did sort of a cross-country tour training every single refugee board member. And we continue to kind of hold the refugee board to account on their implementation of the SOGI guidelines through letter writing, through showing up for consultations, and for letting them know when we see problems. Can we go back one, please, Adam? The other area that we got very active in was when the refugee system was overhauled by the Conservative government using something that they were calling the designated country of origin list, and by expanding the safe third country agreement coverage. And we advocated against the idea that nations or countries could be considered universally or monolithically safe, and that queer and trans people are often impacted by dangers or violence that go on even in otherwise sort of democratic countries. And so it is paramount that the case-by-case decision-making continue. And so we went, again, used strategic litigation and presentations to parliamentarians against the designated country of origin list. And we're continuing this tradition by intervening in the current Supreme Court challenge of the Safe Third Country Agreement. And so both Rainbow Railroad and Rainbow Refugee have successfully obtained intervener status in that case that is, in process now. Can we move forward, Adam? Thank you. Just sharing a little bit more about the guidelines that were implemented, continue to stay in place, and have been expanded now to include sex characteristics, so protections for intersex people. And we've been working on training for lawyers and community agencies. So those things are all in place. And what we are seeing is, in many ways, an in-Canada refugee system that is safer and more equitable than it was 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, but that still needs attention and vigilance, because ultimately it comes down to the decision-making power of one board member. And that requires vigilance in terms of making sure that the border policies that we have do not use country of origin as sort of the decision-making criteria or screening and streaming criteria. And can we move forward, Adam? So what we have seen is a movement from, an initial complete exclusion of sexual orientation and gender identity from the refugee protection system, and this is internationally as well. So when you look at the definition of a refugee in the Geneva Convention, there is no mention of sexual orientation or gender identity. A movement to in the 1990s was when we first, Canada extended refugee protection based on sexual orientation for the first time. We saw the UNHCR in 1995 recommend this recognition on an international basis. There was another sort of moment of traction sort of in the 2008 through 2012 when the UNHCR worked on a guidance note and hosted its first LGBTQI refugee roundtable. Refugee lawyer Nicole Laviolette, who's a professor in Ottawa, was Canada's representative and has been instrumental in creating sort of policies at the international level and national level that promote better decision-making and inclusion for LGBTQI refugees. And then the third sort of, I'll say, moment of traction that we've seen is more recent in Canada with the 2017 SOGI guideline. And then in 2021, those guidelines were revised and the UNHCR hosted an LGBTQI refugee protection roundtable. Instead of a roundtable of 12 experts sitting around a table, the UNHCR had over 400 people participating in 3 weeks worth of consultations, and the recommendations coming out of that give us some traction to work with looking forward. Next slide, please. And so what I've spoken about is sort of shifts in the in-Canada refugee claim process and some of the international momentum building. And now I'm going to turn things over to Alex to talk more specifically about resettlement pathways. So our attention turned, from what we were learning in Canada to how do we extend protection beyond our borders for people needing resettlement from abroad. Alex.
Thank you, Charlene. I am not sure that this is the part where I turn into, actually. I think it's not.
Did I get ahead of myself? I'm so
yes,
sorry.
I think you did. No worries.
Okay, sorry. Oh, so Adam, we'll keep going. Oh, yes, now I remember.
No worries.
So the work we were doing to advocate in Canada was teaching us a great deal about what was needed for people who, as I said, could not even leave their country of origin or managed to get out of their country of origin, but then remained in, the countries that they could get to were often countries that shared similar legal sanctions and social conditions that made it incredibly unsafe. So we were learning more and more about the conditions that people were trying to survive under and the obstacles that they were facing in accessing UNHCR protection. As I shared, the UNHCR has made some movement to expand their protection and make it responsive to LGBTQI people over the past few decades, but there remains, as all of you know, incredible obstacles. It really does come down to, the person who is the security guard at the gate saying, no, you don't get in today, and people not having safe housing, fearing going out to get groceries. We've seen people who have faced incredible violence during their time waiting. And so this is where we were advocating for the need for an LGBTQI specific pathway that we had some control over. And so Rainbow Refugee was meeting with the Minister of Immigration, and in that process managed to secure a commitment from the Minister of Immigration for something that was a pilot, the Rainbow Refugee Assistance, now partnership, but then pilot. And so that was in 2010 and 11. And we continued our advocacy over the next few years, working with collaborators in the coalition to make sure that this program really reflected, the best possible ways of doing sponsorship as solidarity, and also working to advocate to make it a more stable program. Because initially it was just, 15 people and had to be renewed every year. Now we have a commitment of over 50 people per year, an additional 150 specifically for Afghans, and we have a longer term horizon of renegotiating at each 5 years rather than every year. So this work has taken, again, sort of consultations with IRCC, presentations to parliamentary standing committees, and a great deal of work with bureaucrats. Can we have the next slide, please? So yeah, the pilot began in 2011. Next slide. And you can see the partners there. We've now had 25 communities participate as arrival communities, and over 300 people have settled through the sponsorship program. Next slide. It was Pride season in 2018, where we were able to meet with then Minister Hassan and MP Randy Boissonneau to celebrate that the Rainbow Refugee Assistance Pilot became a partnership, its expansion, and its longevity. So a proud moment there. One of the things we did in this work was create a working group within IRCC to establish some priorities, and Alex will share more about these, but some priorities for increasing the equity and safety and inclusiveness of IRCC, IRB, and hopefully CBSA as well. We're working on that one. For LGBTQI persons. So we established 7 priorities with them in 2018, and a sort of consultation process, and we continue to engage with them. We also created this lovely journey map. It took us lots of sticky notes. It was a teaching and learning tool for bureaucrats, and we have found that it's actually quite helpful in our own work. And so Adam has placed that in the chat, and just invite you to use it as it is helpful to you. And then the next piece of work for us as a coalition is extending this kind of journey map beyond the moment of arrival and initial settlement into longer term kind of settlement integration, or what we call kind of thriving, and very much helping not just the federal government, but also the provincial governments understand some of the distinct challenges in settlement that queer and trans people, and specifically queer and trans refugees, face in communities in Canada. Next slide, please. And so, yeah, I think we were going to take a moment here to just pause to see if there's any clarifying questions. There's another section that Alex is going to carry us through in terms of resettlement. And so, yeah, happy to respond to any questions or clarifications folks have now. Steph, acronyms, thank you so much. Yes. Maybe, Adam, do we have the acronym sheet handy that we can share with people? And if not, we'll send that out after, but I can share a few things. Yes, Steph, thank you. Accessibility. So UNHCR, UN High Commission on Refugees, is the international body that sort of governs and manages refugee protection. Within Canada, we have IRCC, Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada, and then IRB, the Immigration and Refugee Board, they are the decision-making body and an independent tribunal for in Canada refugee claims. IRCC, Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada, is sort of the federal bureaucracy that manages migration. And we'll all stay mindful to explain acronyms as we go. Thanks for that. Anything else? Okay. I think I get to pass it. Oh. Great question. Is there, yeah, no, there is no annual quota for LGBTQI refugees. And in fact, we've had some challenges even getting clear data from Immigration, Refugees, Citizenship Canada about the specific numbers of people who arrive because of SOGS persecution. They do not officially track that. They say they don't ever track specific calls with, remember that refugees who are queer or trans apply not under SOGIESC, but that broader refugee protection category of membership in a particular social group. And so the membership in a particular social group covers LGBTQI refugees, but also covers people who are fleeing gender or domestic violence, covers people who are fleeing around HIV-based persecution. So it's a big kind of category, and IRCC and IRB do not publicly or officially track those numbers, and we need to work with them on some accountability measures. We understand the need to not publish those numbers in a way that might harm, people's anonymity. If there's only 2 people who settle in Moose Jaw who are LGBTQ refugees, we understand that could be a dangerous statistic to publish, but we do want to have some accountability. Glad the documents are helpful. That's super. And so I think this is a good time to turn things over to Alex for real this time.
Thank you, Charlene. I really appreciate it. So now I'm going to give you an overview about the resettlement process, but also about the resettlement pathways that are available for LGBTQ refugees, and also complementary pathways. So we'll be talking about that. And then at the end of my presentation, I will speak about the coalition's advocacy priorities in this area for 2023, and some of the recommendations that we have made together. Also as you saw in the journey map, some of the recommendations of the journey map, and also some other recommendations that have come up since the journey map, which was in 2018 till today. And we will maybe focus a little bit on that. So as you can see, the resettlement process is overseas. So a person must leave their country. They're forcibly displaced out of their country of origin, and they seek protection in usually a neighboring country. Sometimes in those neighboring countries, the UNHCR, which is the UN agency for the protection of refugees, will do the assessment and declare a person a refugee. And sometimes it's the country, the neighboring country, who does that process. But in whichever case, UNHCR is in most cases involved providing some sort of protection or services to the people that are there, to the LGBTQ people that are there. However, we need to know that UNHCR certification is not needed for all kinds of private sponsorship that happen here in Canada. So for instance, if a private sponsorship or someone is being sponsored to Canada through a sponsorship agreement holder, which is a lot of organizations in Canada have that status, which is an agreement they have with the government to sponsor people into Canada, then you don't need UNHCR certification. But if you're being sponsored as a government-sponsored refugee, it's the UNHCR that is giving that referral directly to the Canadian government. And so then there's an application for resettlement to Canada. And as I mentioned, it's either you get picked up by Canadian government and you come as a government-sponsored refugee, or you get referred by an organization, and then you are a privately sponsored refugee. And then once you arrive to Canada, you become a permanent resident. You are a landed immigrant, and that's when your journey for settlement begins. Next slide, please, Adam. So there is a need to have LGBTQ specific resettlement pathways. And the main one that we have today is the Rainbow Refugee Assistance Partnership, which was particularly created to address the distinct risks and settlement challenges faced by refugees who have fled persecution. SOGS persecution, which someone was asking in the chat, what is SOGS persecution? Which is sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. So when we say sex characteristics, some people don't understand what we mean. So it usually means intersex. That's who we are including with those categories, and also HIV status. So we also sponsor, or one of the categories for sponsorship would be also to have HIV status. And the idea was to create pathways to safety to more accepting communities of LGBTQI refugees who are at risk in the countries of asylum. And in 2011, the federal government actually appointed Rainbow Refugee, and as you heard already in the history, it was a surprise. They just called and said, well, now you have to manage this program. And thank goodness that Rainbow Refugee said, yes, we will manage the program for you. And it created, and the idea was to create a program that had a nationwide reach. So right now, the Rainbow Refugee signs off the sponsorship of LGBTQI refugees across Canada. And then on June 2019, after being a pilot project, Canada extended and expanded the former pilot project to continue as a partnership. So now it's called a partnership. And as you heard, we work with 25 communities and organizations across Canada. And we're hoping in the future to make this partnership a permanent program of Canada. So no matter what the government, what tendencies the government are in place, that this is a program for the Canadian immigration system that continues on for years to come. So next slide, please, Adam. So the goals of the Rainbow Refugee Assistance Partnership, as we have mentioned, why it was created is because we needed to create safe pathways for refugee protection of LGBTQI refugees. You heard from Chris that the idea was also to call the community, what can we do? So it does encourage the community and the participation of local LGBTQI civil society to have a response and to come together to do refugee sponsorship. So you will know that across Canada, maybe you'll know them as settlement teams, maybe you'll know them as circles of care, or you'll know them as circles of hopes. But that's the way the community comes together and provides 1 year settlement support and sponsorship to a person, and to promote a resettlement pathway that is responsive to the distinct settlement challenges of LGBTQI refugees. So we don't have the same challenges. We have the same challenges as the general population, and then we have added challenges because of identity, because of sexuality, and those are being taken care of by this pathway. Next slide. So what are the main characteristics of the Rainbow Refugee Assistance Partnership? Is that there exists right now 50 cost-sharing spots per year between 2020 and 2024. When we would have to renegotiate this partnership with the government. So what that means, 50 cost-sharing spots, is that the government provides 3 months of income support at RAP rates, so at Rainbow Assistance Partnership rates, which are the regular rates that the government gives to any sponsored or government-sponsored refugee into the country, and startup support that would be support for furniture, household items, etc. The sponsorship groups are responsible then for raising the additional funds, equivalent to 12 months of living income and communities of arrival. And I know someone already mentioned, is there a limit about how many LGBTQ refugees we can sponsor? There is no limit. From 2020 to 2024, we have 50 cost-sharing spots, meaning the government is willing to invest in 50 of those files. However, there is no cap or limit for the amount of sponsorship that can be submitted. It doesn't count against sponsorship agreement holders caps to be able to sponsor people into the country. And the only limit that we do have is getting volunteers to want to be involved in the work, having enough financial resources, because we are making a 1 year commitment to the people that we're sponsoring, and also the processing times. So depending on how fast the processing times are happening and how many volunteers are being liberated from their previous engagement so that they can take on a new engagement. And the final main characteristics is that we are creating communities of belonging for people who are being persecuted based on the SOGS identities, migrants and refugees, particularly as it relates to care, advocacy, systemic change, relationship building, which can be life-saving, empowering, and make a difference. So we want to make sure that the extended LGBTQI community is engaging in this work so that we can create a community of belonging where we are welcoming communities for LGBTQI people so that they can thrive here in Canada while continuing with their life plans. So next slide, please. So we're going to talk a little bit about the eligibility criteria. So who are the people that are being able to be sponsored into Canada? So first of all, they have to comply with the general definition of a refugee, which means that you need to face persecution related to one of the categories. And one of the categories is that have been read in is that there is persecution based on sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristic, that you have been forcibly displaced. That means you are outside of your country of origin and you're unable to return because you have a well-founded fear of persecution, that you remain at a high risk of criminalization, violence, and homelessness and other harms in your countries of asylum, and that you do not have a durable solution in the countries of asylum, another offer for resettlement, or you cannot return to your own country. So a durable solution would be that a person can resettle in that first country of asylum that they went to. A durable solution means that maybe the circumstances that force them to escape their countries of origin have ceased, they're no longer there, so they can return. Or a durable solution may be another offer from another country for resettlement before Canada offers that option. And the pillars of the Rainbow Refugee Assistance Partnership, which is the next slide, are as follows. So we follow these are the main principles that we follow, which is program integrity, equity, and intersectional approach, and doing this work from a solidarity perspective. So program integrity means that we are making sure that the individuals that we're sponsoring meet the criteria that we talked to above, like in the previous slide. We have to satisfy that Rainbow Refugee use a combination of documentation, independent referrals, and interviews to make sure that we are verifying the as much as we can the circumstances and the eligibility and admissibility of the people that we are putting applications for. Equity means that we have a commitment and a responsibility to strive for equity and fairness. And we know that there are certain categories of LGBTQI refugees who face greater obstacles to accessing protection. For instance, people who are identified as women, trans and gender diverse people, minors, people with disabilities who face additional legal, financial, and social barriers may have a difficult time escaping their countries of origin and then being in a second country of asylum. And so we understand that the majority of people sometimes that we're able to sponsor are those who have an easier time traveling, and that would be generally cis gay men. So we do make an effort to make sure that other people who are more in disadvantage of their mobility and in being forcibly displaced have the opportunity to also be sponsored through the Rainbow Refugee Assistance Partnership. And we use an intersectional assessment approach of risk and access to screen the applications. And we strongly encourage groups to consider factors that may place individuals in heightened risk and harm when making also those decisions. We are always encouraging circles of hopes or settlement teams or circles of care to consider also those criteria when making a commitment to a person to come to Canada. And finally, we do this from a solidarity perspective. And if Adam, you can put the next slide. So a solidarity perspective as opposed to a charity perspective means that instead of being top down or in one way or the help is coming only the people who are saying, okay, we're going to save this person, right? Sometimes we use that language that we disencourage the use of that language, right? We do it from a solidarity perspective, which means it's multi-directional and mutual. And we are including those people who are perceived to be in need in the decision making, in the pathways that are being chosen, and also including them in the work that we do every day. The expertise doesn't only lie on the helper, so we are not consider ourselves as the expert, but also in the impacted person. So there's a bilateral conversation, a multi-directional conversation about where the expertise lies, and we come together in collaboration. The deficiencies or the reasons why people may be forcibly displaced is not because of a trait of an individual. The fault is not because I am gay or I am trans, that means that I am forcibly displaced, but it becomes because of the system. The system is oppressing trans and gay people. The system is transphobic or homophobic. The system is racist. The system is the one who are forcibly displacing people. And it aims to end system of oppressions. Instead of looking at only the specific circumstances of people, it also looks at the systemic impact of the ways in which people are being forcibly displaced. And then the accountability of the work that we do is not only inwards. We're not only accountable if we're an organization, for instance, we're not only accountable to our board of directors, we're not only accountable to our funders, but we're also accountable to the broader community that it is engaged in this work. We're also accountable to each other as doing this work, so that the solidarity model also asks accountability for organizations and people doing the work to the wider community, and particularly to the LGBTQI refugee community. Thank you, Adam. Next slide. And so to also address some of those systemic issues that were being present at the time with resettlement, we were concerned that some private and PSRs start for private sponsorship of refugee. So private sponsorship of refugee processing timelines were really extremely different if you were coming from the Middle East. So the processing times, for instance, if you were coming from Turkey, might be a year and a half, 2 years. If you were coming from some African countries, it might take up to 4 to 6 years to be processed. So independently as the reasons for why, the impact that this was happening was that people who were Black people and people from African countries would have to wait way longer times than other people who did not identify with that racial identity from other parts of the world. And so racism was an impact of those policies. And sometimes it is not about the policies itself. Sometimes it is about for instance, where the resource allocations and the monies allocations in the visa office that don't have enough resources to process people in time. And that is also a decision that policymakers are making around what to fund and what not to fund. So concerned about those inequities, there was an advocacy done, especially by Lisa Herbert and Charlene Jordan, with Minister Hussein, to use the Blended Visa Office Refer Program, that's what BVOR stands for, Blended Visa Office Refer Program, as a way to bring people directly from Kenya. They had, and we had so far, I think this was in 2018, in 2019, I think this was done, and then we brought 25 people who were at risk in their context. And the Blended Visa Office Refer Program is a program that exists. It's a program Canada-wide that exists, and it's a blended program because the government provides 6 months of financial supports, and private sponsorship provide the other 6 months, while the private sponsor also provides settlement support throughout the year. Now, the blended program is a general program, but within that program, we advocated for a particular aspect for LGBTQI refugees at risk. And at this time, we are also, now that the BVOR general program has been restarted again, we're advocating to be able to extend the LGBTQI at risk BVOR pilot project even further. Thank you, Adam. Next slide. So there's not only resettlement pathways as we know them, but there's also complementary pathways to be able to bring LGBTQI refugees into Canada. So in 2018, the Global Compact on Refugees recognized that there was a need for more effective and innovative responses, and recognized at that time the complementary pathways for refugees was in another third country solution in addition to resettlement. So this is not in replacement of resettlement, but this is in addition to resettlement pathway. Resettlement pathways has to do with a humanitarian need, and is based on a humanitarian need. A complementary pathway is based on the need, but is taking into consideration the skills that a refugee might take and others as well. So next slide, please. We're going to learn what is a complementary pathway. So a complementary pathway is a legal migration pathway for refugees in addition, like I said, in addition to the traditional resettlement. It can take many, many forms. Mainly it takes, right now we're talking more about economic pathways, and so the labor mobility, but it can also be an educational pathway when a university decides to sponsor someone and then puts them in their in a program, in an educational program, and it exists today. Or it can be also family reunification when we're not considering what are the specific aspects of displacements of a person, but the fact that already a refugee is here and they want to bring their family into Canada, and they might also be forcibly displaced, but the link there is through the family link. And also it expands the concept of refugee mobility from solely humanitarian also into including skills, ability, and other attributes. Now, this is how the government defines complementary pathways. This is not to say that there's no concerns about that, because we want to make sure that actually it is in addition to, and that barriers, for instance, people with disabilities, LGBTQI people, and people who have mobility issues to be able to go to other places to seek asylum, do have access to complementary pathways as well. Next slide, please, Adam. So the guiding principles of the complementary pathways are additionality, permanent protection and a durable solution, dignity and empower, and settlement support. And what this means is, again, is that it has to be in addition to resettlement and not instead of resettlement, that a person has a permanent solution. So imagine in the labor mobility pathway, for instance, if someone were to be brought here to have to be brought here for an employer and to have a job in a particular way, even if they were to be to resign that job, or they were to be fired for that job, that doesn't jeopardize at all their permanency here in Canada, that they are landing as a permanent resident. That they're also highlighting the opportunities about developing their skills and already having work as soon as they arrive. And also settlement supports, meaning that no matter which pathway you have come, is it in mobility, is it a complementary pathway, or is it a settlement pathway, that you are going to receive resettlement support throughout the year of sponsorship. So it still acts as a way of in following the model of the sponsorship program. Next slide, please. So the three complementary pathways that I want to focus our attention on is the Economic Mobility Pathway Project, called EMPP, the Afghan Refugee Rainbow Assistance Partnership Project, and the Human Rights Defender Immigration Stream. And so the Economic Mobility Pathways Project was started or launched in April of 2018, and it only started with 10 to 15 skilled refugee workers. And the target population was urban and camp-based from the Middle East. So it was from Jordan, Lebanon, and East Africa in Kenya. And they were aligning refugees with skill level that align with existing permanent economic immigration programs. So high and intermediate skilled people. And the idea is that a settlement agency then prepares a settlement plan for an individual that is identified as having a particular skill. Once the plan is prepared, they actually contact out an employer and produce an employment contract. Then the employer signs that contract for 1 year full time according to normal wages. So the wages are competitive wages from the community, and refer the client to IRCC then for this program, and they apply on their behalf. And the processing approximately takes from 12 to 18 months mark because of the offer of employment. Now, this was launched, like I said, in 2018, and there were 10 to 15. Now in 2020, it was extended 2 more years in 2020 to admit up to 500 applicants. And then in December, the immigration department said it would work with employers to expand the program to welcome 2,000 skilled refugees. So that's the level that we are hearing today. I'm going to also talk a little bit about the human rights defender immigration stream before I talk about the Afghan Rainbow Wrap. So the human rights defender is in 2021, IRCC, or Immigration Refugee Citizenship Canada, launched the human rights defenders immigration stream. And it made Canada with 2 referral partners, Frontline Defenders and Protect Defenders, who are not Canadian organizations. They're foreign organizations who are giving referrals to Canada about who is a human rights defenders abroad, who has been forcibly displaced, who's in need of protection, and they provide those referrals to the UNHCR, and then the UNHCR has to provide a certificate and then gives that ultimate referral to Canada to bring people through this program. So as it was started, it was 250 people per year. And one of the challenges that we have faced is that it's extremely hard for us to be able to provide those referrals to these organizations, that we are not sure how many LGBTQ people, we are not sure about how many LGBTQ people are actually getting into these programs and are coming through the Human Rights Defenders program. The fact that the UNHCR is asking, or that the Canadian government is asking for UNHCR certification, puts an additional barrier, because LGBTQ people sometimes do not trust UNHCR local offices to be able to disclose their identity. So there's still some problems that we're trying to advocate for, and that we are pushing as well to try to find a way to be also a referral partner, so that LGBTQI human rights defender can also have access to this complementary pathway. And then the Rainbow Wrap, the Rainbow Refugee Assistance Partnership Afghan project, meant that we advocated for the government in able to have 150 extra cost-sharing spots for exclusively for LGBTQI Afghans after the Afghan crisis, so that we were able to encourage communities here in Canada to sponsor people, knowing that there was going to be some financial support from the government if we were to sponsor LGBTQI Afghans. Next slide, please, Adam. So I want to talk a little bit about what response we had to the Afghan crisis. So Rainbow Refugee, as I said, extended or advocated to extend to 150 more cost-sharing spots for 2022, 2023, and 2024 in bringing LGBTQI refugees. We also assisted in the evacuation of LGBTQI Afghans out of Afghanistan through a collaboration that we did with UNHCR, who was in contact with some European governments to be able to take. So we were receiving some information about people being inside of Afghanistan who were in need of protection, who were LGBTQI, and we were then giving this information to UNHCR so that then they could arrange with some European countries to be taken out of Afghanistan directly. And we also participate with Mosaic in the Metro Vancouver Refugee Readiness Team, in which we provide our expertise around how to welcome LGBTQI Afghans, but also Ukrainians into Canada as well. And we have advocated, as I said, with IRCC to have a crisis response for LGBTQI refugees as well, that is comprehensive. And we will talk a little bit more about that in the next period. And then I want to now talk about the advocacy priorities and recommendations, and that would be the next slide. So the advocacy priorities and recommendations that we have done for 2023, 2022, 2023 is to ensure that the Rainbow Refugee Assistance Partnership applications that have been submitted in 2020, because there are still applications we submitted in 2020 in which we have not seen arrivals. So the ones that we have submitted in 2020, 2021, and 2022 be expedited for processing, and that they would arrive at the latest in December, at the latest December 31st, 2022. So we're still trying 2023, so we're still trying to accomplish that goal, and we continue to advocate about that. And to also restart the pilot project to resettle LGBTQI refugees in Kenya, working with the coalition as a referring partner. So we want to be able to continue to provide the names of the people who are in Kenya, who are LGBTQI, who may have some challenges in being able to access the resettlement pathway so that they can come through the DBOR program. So those are just our advocacy priorities for 2022-2023. However, we have recommendations that far exceed those priorities as well, which is to ensure, and you will have then access to the slides. So I'm just going to highlight a few that are systemic first. So this first slide talks a little bit about the systemic. And one of the things I want to highlight is respect of legal recognition of gender identity in all documentation from the start. So we have been advocating for people to be able to land in Canada already with the document matching their gender identity. And we also want to develop a community consultation and crisis response plan for LGBTQI refugees from across regions and geographical regions, and to have a crisis response that is transparent, that is effective, and that takes into consideration the barriers and the specific barriers that different LGBTQI identities face when trying to flee a crisis situation. So as you can see there, we also want to want to ensure visibility, anti-oppression, and anti-racism principles in immigration policies. We want IRCC to increase and strengthen their partnership with civil society, with LGBTQI civil society, and hopefully also expand the definition of family to include queer families and chosen families beyond the Western, very restricted two parents and kids kind of family definition. And next slide, Adam. And we also want to expand opportunities for resettlement and make sure that in those opportunities for resettlement are being funded by the government so that there's secure permanent funding for that. And why I say that is that because not everybody in LGBTQ communities have access to financial resources in certain ways than others. And we want to make sure that people, especially trans and gender diverse people, are also able to sponsor and be part of circles of hope and settlement teams, even if they don't have the financial means or the capacity to fundraise, through having some permanent funding from the government. We have always been advocating to have SOGI-esque training as a system-wide standard for resettlement. And as you heard from Sherilyn before, the IRB follows guideline number 9, which was developed to provide a lot of guidance to people who are making refugee determination here inland in Canada. And we want those guidelines to be extended also to visa officers abroad, so that when they're doing their refugee determination is equity based across the board. And also, the last point I wanted to emphasize from this list is to provide mental health supports across the resettlement continuum that is sensitive to intersectional trauma that LGBTQI face. And we have had a lot of problems in making sure that IFHP, and IFHP stands for Interim Federal Health Program. So it's the program that extends benefits, health benefits to refugees when they arrive for their first year of sponsorship. And included in those benefits is mental health support. So you can see a counselor and it will be paid by these extended benefits. And still we have not seen in practice that working out. So we need to be able to advocate for that. At the same time, we need more government programs that deal with this, but that go beyond the first year, because we have noticed that people may not be ready during their first year of settlement to actually deal with the trauma that they're bringing. They may be ready at the second year or at their third year. Whenever they're ready, that these resources are available for them free of cost, because it is a huge barrier right now to access mental health supports. And this is what I wanted to bring to you today. And I think the next slide might be questions and comments. And I don't know if anyone can help me see if there are any questions or comments. I see that the chat was really going, and because I was concentrating doing the presentation, I wasn't paying attention. But if you can help me out, Charlene or Adam. I see one question that says, is this financial help only for those who are sponsored and come from overseas, not in Canada? Yes, that is true. This financial support is for the resettlement program. And the resettlement program is a program that works with refugees who are abroad, who are then being brought into Canada. For inland refugee claimants, there is no federal government support in the terms of financial support. What exists is that based on the provinces, social assistance is usually extended for refugee claimants, and it will the rates and the eligibility for those programs would be in accordance to each of the provinces. So people who are refugee claimants who are put in refugee protections here in Canada can access social assistance, but they cannot access these kinds of resettlement supports.
We have a question from Horst. Who
Yes.
initiated referral to the economic mobility pathway?
Sorry, can I ask you, can you tell me again?
It's in the chat. Who initiates a referral to the economic mobility pathway? Is there a way that refugees can apply for this directly?
Yes, well, my understanding is that no, the refugees don't apply for this directly, and that who initiates it, settlement agencies. So settlement agencies like right now, the mobility pathway is not extended to all across Canada. It's just in the Atlantic region at this moment. And there's specific settlement agencies that have this contracted this with the government. In which they are actually, and I don't know what their internal system might be to identify the refugee who is abroad, but they are the people identifying the refugee who's abroad who may have this skill. Then they are preparing a settlement plan for that particular person. Then they are connecting with the employer and getting the employment contract. That's how it works at this time. And it's only in the Atlantic region, and it has not been expanded to the rest of Canada as of yet. But we see that it probably will be, and that is a good opportunity to actually also have an advocacy ask for IRCC to be able to feed into that. Charlene, do you wanted to say anything?
Sorry, just catching this now. A request from a couple folks in the audience to slow the pace down a bit.
Oh, sure.
And the recording of this session will be available tomorrow in your inbox as well. So if there's anything that you didn't catch, you'll be able to watch it again. Yeah.
Any other questions?
If you want more information about the Rainbow Wrap, you can email me, coordinator@rainbowrefugee.ca. I will write it in the chat in a bit. Happy to provide more information. And if you are in Vancouver and interested in sponsoring an LGBTQI refugee, as an individual, we're happy to do that. And if your organization does LGBT refugee sponsorship, then please connect with us if you want to be involved in sponsorship of Rainbow Wrap as well through the Rainbow Wrap. Any other questions?
Yes, you will receive the I think you will also receive the PowerPoint information and access to the recording as well.
I'll share a little bit. This webinar is part of a larger project. And so the coalition members are all collaborating to create a bit of a resource hub so that people who are involved in supporting LGBTQ refugees across the country can access materials, things like the webinar. And so this is something that we're in the process of building. We're also branding or rebranding ourselves as Borders to Belonging. So please kind of keep an eye on your inbox. Adam will be sending updates as we move along in this process. But there will be definitely the access to the recordings, some information sheets that we're creating, things like that.
I should highlight that the sponsorship is not currently available in Quebec.
Yeah, because Quebec as a province administers its own immigration and refugee policies and practices, the sponsorship program is available in the other provinces and territories, not Quebec. We are working with coalition member and partner Agir, and I think we have some people from Agir here. And there's some discussion about what would it take to create a similar program in Quebec.
And with that, we reach to the end of our time together. Thank you so much for attending. Big thank you to our speakers and troublemakers for your advocacy, our interpreters behind the scene, Alain, and sorry, I forgot the other name. I'm sorry, I'm terrible at this. Francis, sorry.
Francis.
Please let us know how we did so we can improve for future webinars. I will copy and paste the link again for the survey, and you'll receive it in your inbox tomorrow as well. Our next webinar will be on April 28th. So the topic is LGBTQI refugee settlement, the challenges, the strategies, and the recommendations. Also, the link to register will be in the chat and in your inbox tomorrow. We hope you can join us. If you received the email, also please send it to your colleagues or anyone who would benefit to hear, even as information, even if they are not working directly with LGBTQI refugees, the information will help. So thanks a lot again for attending, and have a good rest of your day. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all so
your
much.
Weekend.
Have great weekends.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Chris, thank you. I never get bored of hearing that story. Adam, fantastic work. You always,
Adam.
you really keep things moving well and smoothly, and I'm very thankful. And look at us, we're color coordinated today.
We
didn't even plan it.
That's true. If we spend enough time, there'll be other coordinations happening.
It was subliminal. I woke up this morning and said, I want a blue shirt.
We're all in the blue. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye. Have a good